Hey, everyone. Welcome to the podcast edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Seated across from me is my friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
I'm not feeling very good. I've kind of felt like I took you and Mr. Jefferson to some dark places.
No, you brought up Plato, and then you brought up so Jefferson's attitude towards Plato, which one of our listeners asked us to talk about.
And then a simple question that doesn't get asked enough, the difference between a democracy and a republic.
Right. So when I go give talks around the country, if I use the word democracy, someone comes up afterwards. It's always a white male who's 60 years older, and he says, "We were never intended to be a democracy. We're a republic. I don't know why you don't understand that." And then I say, I know the difference. But today we actually tried to sort it out a little bit about how a republic works.
This is a pretty good imitation of me on a bad day.
Yeah, I was trying to do you. But I get that all the time. And it is true, we are a republic. And the Founding Fathers definitely wanted a republic and not a democracy. There's no question about that. Which is why we have the Electoral College, which is why we have presidential veto power, which is why we have a Supreme Court that can strike down legislation.
But as I said to Jefferson a couple of times, it gets to be a bit of a delicate dance when you try to explain all of this and how it fits together and how it works.
Do you, David, really want direct democracy?
In a small enough situation, yeah.
Yeah, small is beautiful.
But I also said that we have no direct vote in anything. I asked you, we can't think of anything where there isn't a buffer between the voter and what the law is.
And the reason is, I'll tell you, this happens to me. It happens to me all the time. Something happens where I'm offended, affronted, hurt, and I then react. If I do what Jefferson said and count to 10 or count to 100, I do a much better job.
I know what you're talking about.
No, but it's true all the time. That there has to be a way of letting passions cool.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of a republic, that if I say to you, we have this terrible problem with cyber terrorism, let's shut down the First Amendment. You're supposed to say, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Because I know how you feel. I know why I know why you're saying that, Mr. Jenkinson. But really? Really, do you think that you want to shut down the First Amendment? I might veto that, because I'll tell you what, this isn't the first time this has happened in American history. And every time we succumb to those passions, we pay a terrible price. And when we resist them, it makes us a more robust culture. I want you to think twice before you do that. I'm going to slow this down, because I think a week from now you might not share that. You might not hold that view any longer.
Right.
That, I think, is absolutely true about my nature, about human nature, and about public life. And I think that every time there's a 9/11, remember, almost days after 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed. We have regretted some provisions of it ever since. It is always a mistake to make major decisions for a third of a billion people based upon sudden passions. And so I do believe that a republic is superior. On the other hand, when you see Bush v. Gore in the year 2000, you realize that 5 members of the Supreme Court get to decide who the next president is. And I know there are going to be people who say blah, blah, blah about the Bush v. Gore. Let's just say that Gore was really elected, including in Florida. Then if the court of the 5 Republicans had said, you know what, it's Gore, and the 4 Democrats had said, you know what, we think it might be Bush, we'd have greater respect for the system. But when people vote predictably along partisan lines in circumstances of that importance, that's when cynicism enters the equation.
Well, we've seen that our entire lives. I mean, the distrust of government, starting with
never been greater.
Kennedy and Watergate and everything else. But that's not where this show
Never
was.
Been greater.
So should we go to the show?
Let's listen now. We talk about Plato. That never comes up on this show. But here's my question. Here's my quiz for the people who are listening. John Adams said that the only thing he learned from reading Plato's Republic was how to cure hiccups. So I wonder if our listeners know what Plato's prescription for hiccups was. Listen now to this special podcast edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks for listening.
This week on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a special rebroadcast from 2016 titled Too Much Freedom. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated before me is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
I trust the weather in Virginia is as glorious as it is here on the Northern Plains, sir.
Oh, more so. More so.
I doubt that.
No rational being would live anywhere but in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
I'll move on, if I might.
Mr. Lewis said the winters were cold in Dakota.
Oh, they are. They build character, sir.
Yes, well, my character is something like an orangutan's. I crave the sun. I crave warmth and comfort.
And will that you should have it, sir. I was hoping I could talk to you about something that I don't know a lot about, but I know you do, and that's Plato's Republic. I have a couple of questions about it. I read a long article by an author, Andrew Sullivan. The title is Democracies End When They Are Too Democratic. Could you perhaps explain to our listeners Plato's Republic and why you read it and why it was so important to you, sir?
I don't think anybody can explain Plato's Republic, and I include Plato himself in this. I read it a number of times in Greek, in ancient Greek. John Adams read it during our retirement friendship in ancient Greek. We both agreed that it was tedious and in many respects impenetrable. I think Adams said it was the greatest task work that he had ever had in his entire life as a classicist, and he said that the only thing that he learned from all of Plato's writings was a recipe for stopping hiccups.
Truly.
Yes. So that wasn't very high praise. I didn't like Plato either because of his metaphysics. I'm a materialist. I believe that the world is measurable. I believe that that which is immeasurable, is not capable of being measured, is probably not worth a moment's attention. I'm a believer that the soul is corpuscular. That is, that our soul exists in our body, and when we die, for whatever reason, our soul dies with us, that there's no independent life of the soul. And that would mean that my entire way of seeing, you could call it Aristotelian if you like, but my entire way of seeing is anti-Platonic. So let me first of all start by just giving you a very superficial sense of Plato's basic outlook. Plato believed that there is a world that we cannot see, but nevertheless is real, in which there are pure forms. So let's take dog, for example. That's a very easy example. Think of the number of different four-legged creatures that are called dogs. A Chihuahua is a dog. A Great Dane is a dog. A Schnauzer is a dog. A Dachshund is a dog. There are so many varieties of dog: long hair, short hair, large, small, long tail, short tail, no tail. All of these different creatures are dogs, and they shared what Plato called dogness. They shared the essence of what it was to be a dog, and no earthly dog, no Rover or Spot or, for that matter, Rocinante, no individual dog completely embodied the form, the idea of dogness, but all of them participated to some extent or other in the dogness that was the essence of this idea. The same is true of chairs and of trees: oak trees, elm trees, maple trees, pine trees. So Plato viewed the world as a series of material approximations of ideal forms that exist, can be ascertained by rational thought, but are not ever manifested in three-dimensional space in the world. He also believed that there was truth with a capital T, there was justice, there was beauty, there was love, there was equality, and so on. Well, all of that I find pretty tough to understand and even harder to appreciate. But that's the basis of Plato's general philosophical outlook. In the Renaissance, the great fresco painter Raphael in the Pope's private bedrooms in the Vatican, painted a famous painting called The School of Athens, in which he has Plato standing next to Aristotle in the center of the painting, and Plato is pointing with his finger upward, and Aristotle with his hand is motioning down towards the earth. And this is actually a wonderful symbol of the basic conflict between their two systems, that Plato is an idealist who's pointing up to some world of the empyrean that's beyond human capacity to understand, except in intuitive glimpses. And Aristotle is motioning back down to the real world, the world of physical things, as if to say, all these ideas are very well and good, Plato, but we live in the real world. In the real world, there is not rockness, there's a rock. There's not treeness, but there are pine trees and oak trees and so on. So I take that to be a really interesting illustration of the basic split between Platonic idealism and Aristotelian realism or pragmatism.
Understood, Mr. Jefferson, but what does this have to do with the Republic?
Well, in the Republic, Plato outlines his ideal system of government. He's really talking about justice. And the question is, what is justice and what makes a man just? It's actually quite ingenious in its own way. And what he finally concludes is that the just man does the right thing even if nobody's looking. In other words, if there are 70 people watching me and somebody drops a silver chalice on the ground and I pocket it and run off with it, I'm probably going to be shamed, and my behavior is probably virtuous because I know that I'm being observed. But the question that Socrates in the Republic eventually asks is, what would you do if no one were looking? What if you could get away with murder? What if you could get away with adultery? What if you could get away with theft? What if you could get away with assault and battery? Would you do such things if you knew that you could not be caught or punished? And Socrates eventually, this is a dialogue, he eventually backs all of his interlocutors into the corner, as always, and concludes that the just man does the right thing knowing that he could never be observed. He does it because it's the right thing, not because of peer review or judgment or pressure. He does it because he has trained himself in virtue from childhood. And so how do we get to this point? Plato believed that democracy is a disaster, that the people are incapable of government, that most people are imbeciles through life. They're childlike. They don't really understand the nature of life. They don't understand the forms. They don't understand philosophy. They don't understand civics. They don't know how a government needs to operate. They're really just primitive beings who are moving more or less instinctively through life, and that if we're going to have anything like a good system of governance, they have to be governed by their betters. There has to be a special class of superior people who are specially trained and educated, an elite of extraordinary human beings who then will manage the affairs of the state on behalf of the masses who are dependent and childlike. And in order to do that, you have to create a system in which you break down the family structure and do everything you can to break down selfishness and desire and self-indulgence and narcissism and greed and rapaciousness and so on. So he's essentially creating a utopia of a state like Sparta, in which people are trained, a handful of them from earliest childhood, to be the leaders of their societies, and the masses are essentially just left to their own devices, but they by no means are allowed to get into contact with power, with the seat of government. That, in a superficial nutshell, is what Plato is attempting to argue. But let me give you one more example, which I find quite intriguing. In the Republic, Socrates raises the question of the ring of Gaijis, Gyges. And Gaijis has a ring which when you put it on your finger, you can do anything and you could never be detected. So if you want to steal all of the money from the Treasury of the United States, you can, because there's no chance that you would be detected. If you want to murder somebody, Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton, you can, and you could never be caught. If you wear the ring of Gaijis, there is nothing that you could do, no matter how antisocial or violent or psychotic, that could possibly ever get you caught. And then the question is, if you had the ring of Gaijis and could slip it onto your finger, what would you do? And of course the answer is, if you are a just man, you would live a life of complete virtue, because you are not behaving in a virtuous and rational manner because of peer pressure or the fear of being detected. You are living that life because you have reasoned your way into understanding that it is the most positive, happy, productive, and satisfying life that you could possibly live. So I think it's worth at least pondering what you would do if someone slipped the ring of Gaijis on your finger.
Mr. President, the question that I wanted to ask you was this author's idea that tyranny is probably established out of no other regime than democracy. Socrates said this to Plato.
Right. Plato's view as a conservative, as a very dark conservative who had seen what he took to be the abuses of Athenian democracy, Plato believed that democracy, however attractive it might seem, it inevitably breaks down into tyranny. That when the democracy fails, as it will, it's followed by tyranny. Eventually the tyranny fails and the people will kill the tyrant or banish him. Then they create an aristocracy. The aristocracy will eventually fail. Anyway, you move down through the systems, but the democracy is the least stable of all systems, and inevitably it ends in tyranny.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. This week we've been talking with President Jefferson about Plato's Republic, about Plato, Mr. President, who you said before our break you were no real fan of.
No, I don't like metaphysics in any form. I'm a Baconian. I believe in data, in facts, that you observe how fast an apple falls out of a tree. You work with pendulums. You count the number of grains in a head of wheat. You determine whether you can cross green apples and red apples, and what if they have variegated colors or if one dominates the other. You create an odometer and determine how fast your carriage can move with 2 horses or 4 horses or 6 horses. And for me, data, information, that which can be measured is real, and that which is beyond physics, life of the spirit, the Christian notion of the Holy Ghost, metaphysics, magic, mysticism, the soul even, these things I think are immeasurable. I frankly doubt that most of this exists in any real form. I'm certainly repelled by it as a real or pseudo phenomenon, and I prefer to live in a world in which things can be measured. And so I'm a very serious materialist, probably more than most of your listeners, because I don't believe that the soul has any independent existence outside of the body.
I guess the question for me, Mr. President, is does Plato have a point when he talks about democracy being seized by tyrants? When it has ripened as fully as this, Plato argues that a would-be tyrant will often seize his moment. Does he have a point?
I don't think so. I think that's the outlook of a dark and pessimistic character.
James Madison did, though, did he not?
No, Madison understood. He was an optimist and an idealist. He believed in the capacity of people to govern themselves.
He wrote, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths.
It's certainly true that Mr. Madison and I and John Adams and others were pushing not for democracy but for a republic. And a republic is a more restrained system of leaning on the will of the sovereign, the people.
Can you explain to myself and listeners how you differentiate between a democracy and a republic?
Easily. So in a democracy, let's say there are 1,000 citizens. They come together in a public square. All of them sit there. The question is, should we declare war against Cuba? Somebody is elected moderator or temporary president, and the debate begins, and everybody speaks. Everyone is equally entitled to be listened to with respect, and in the end, we vote, and majority rule determines whether we declare war against Cuba or we don't. But everyone participates. Every vote is of equal importance. In a republic, we have 1,000 citizens. But instead of the 1,000 gathering together in one place, every 100 send a representative to a Congress or to a parliament. And so you get 10 representatives of the people. We try to devise a system in which this actually distills the will of the people in some accurate way. And then those 10 representatives gather together and they make law on behalf of the 1,000. And if they think that, let's say that the 1,000 want to go to war against Cuba because they don't like the mustaches that Cubans wear, then their 10 representatives can say to them, while we respect the will of the people and we know we are your agents, in this case we think you are wrong-headed and that there's no adequate reason to go to war against Cuba merely because the men wear mustaches. And therefore, we are not going to listen to what we take to be the will of the people. We're going to do this other thing. We're going to do what we think is a wiser thing. But we understand that you elected us to represent you, and if you feel that we have failed you, then you must retire us at the next election because we realize that you have a right to govern yourselves. We believe we have the responsibility sometimes to challenge some whimsy, some wave of popular opinion that may be passing through you, but we know we do so at our peril because we are your agents, we are your representatives, and you have a right to fire us if we do not fulfill your will. So I'm going to explain why I don't believe we should go to war against Cuba. We hope that you will understand and will be glad that we distilled your will in this careful way, but if you repudiate us, we realize that you have every right to retire us to private life. That's the difference.
It sounds to me like they're both essentially the same system. One has some safeguards that the other does not.
Precisely. So, Madison said famously in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So if men were angels, we could live without government whatsoever. If our educational systems were perfect, instead of Plato's handful of guardians, we would create a society in which 98 or 99% were entirely capable of self-government. And believe me, I want to push for that. I believe that humans are capable of self-government. I believe that democracy is not mobocracy. I believe that if we will educate people carefully and fully, that we will produce something in the end like a utopia. I don't despair of this. I don't believe that humans are born ill. I don't believe in original sin. I don't believe that there's depravity at the center of human nature. I don't believe that at all. But I understand what Madison is saying, that we should trust the people. We should do everything in our power to fulfill their decided will. We should find mechanisms to determine what their will is. These mechanisms barely existed in my time. And then we should educate so that people rise to the challenge of self-government, and the sooner we get there, the more we can entrust people to the full complement of their natural rights of self-government. But we shouldn't be naive about this. It's going to take time, and we want some restraining or distilling mechanisms to prevent democracy from sometimes slipping into a kind of mob passion.
Well, it sounds like a fairly delicate dance, Mr. President. You'll forgive me, but the fear expressed, maybe too much freedom and liberty is not a good thing.
I don't think that's true.
Isn't it what we're saying here? If in pure democracy is the freedom of it is a dangerous thing?
Let me provide an analogy. I wrote my own 10 Commandments, and this is late in life, 1825. I did it merely as a piece of whimsy, but I said, take things always by their smooth handle, and no man ever regretted having eaten too little, etc. But one of them that I point to now is, when angry, count to 10, and when very angry, count to 100. So in other words, if you say something deeply rude to me, and I respond instantly, I might overreact, I might slap you, I might challenge you to a duel, I might say something horrific. But if I count to 10, I probably have enough distance on that insult to return to equanimity and to respond with something like grace. And if I'm very angry, I should count longer to 100, because then the passion that was roused has probably dissipated. Similarly, if in several instances in my life, when England, for example, would impress our sailors on the high seas or fire at one of our neutral trading ships in American waters, there would be a wave of patriotic fury that would pass through the people. And they would, if at that moment I said, let's declare war on England, I would have been overwhelmingly supported by the people in that instant. But if you wait 2 weeks and say, all right, it was a terrible insult, it's a violation of natural right, this is an intolerable situation, but do you want to go to war? The people then probably would say, well, we were really upset, but maybe the path of negotiation is the smarter path. So you have to have some way of restraining passion under provocation, because this will happen. I saw it many times in the course of my life, and usually patience is the smarter course, and that means there must be a leader who understands restraint, and that leader then exposes himself by saying, I'm not going to just declare war here. I feel as you do. I'm deeply outraged by what Britain has done, but I think that it's in our interest to wait a couple of weeks, to think this over, to calm down and make a rational decision about what's in the best interests of the United States, not what we feel like doing in the heat of this moment.
So we're left with then a form of government in the United States that is a democracy, but it is checked by the values of a republic. In other words, I'm trying to think, Mr. President, of an instance where, in our country, where there really is direct connection between the will of the people and the act of law.
It doesn't happen, and it shouldn't happen. So you now have technologies that we didn't have. You could, the president could address the entire nation, a thing impossible in my time, and he could say, I think we should go to war against Cuba. We're going to spend 2 hours debating this. We're going to bring in experts, people who understand the Caribbean, people who understand the history of Cuba, people who understand the history of America's interaction with the island and its peoples, people who understand the history of colonialism and so on. And after that sober debate, mostly filled with information so that people know exactly what the truth is about the background to this instant, then we're going to have a moment of direct democracy in which I want all of you to lock in your votes at this moment and tell me war against Cuba or no war against Cuba. You could, given the nearly universal access that people in your time have to electronic devices, have a direct democratic vote on certain questions, and you would get a larger response than any society that has ever existed on Earth, with the possible exception of the New England town meeting. Whether that's a good idea is another question. In other words, I am for a republic but not democracy, but I think that the republic needs always to remember that the people are sovereign and that the people have a right to see their will enacted. And if they are emphatic about it, then their officers must either resign or get in line.
Again, Mr. President, it's a delicate dance. We wish that the people had a true voice. We wish that their votes actually counted. We wish that the people were allowed to make direct decisions in government. And yet the way we're set up says, well, we really don't trust the people. We need wiser men to sort of filter their will.
I don't think we need wiser men to distill their will. I think we need mechanisms that create deliberation and slow down the process somewhat and enable calmer voices to prevail. In other words, I don't want Napoleon Bonaparte deciding whether we go to war against Canada or Cuba. I don't want a dictator or a tyrant or an all-powerful monarch of some sort. The people are sovereign. But I do want a leader who says, I hear you, but let's think this through. If you insist, we'll do it. You are sovereign. But I think you're wrong in this instance, and I think here's a better path. And you know what, citizens? You're not as informed about this situation as I am, because you have your lives to lead. You have your children, your families, food, your gardens, your horses, all of the things that compel one's attention. I have the advantage of being asked by you to attend to questions like this, and so I'm arguably in possession of better information, a fuller context about this situation than you can be, because you're not hired to pay attention in an exacting way to circumstances of this sort. So I need you to trust me that there is another path. Now, if you say that you do not trust me, that you demand that we go to war, I will declare war for you, or I will resign. But I want that, I'm not saying wiser person, I want the process to create more deliberation and to give us time to evaluate in a rational way the benefits and the liabilities of any single course of action.
I think it could be argued, Mr. President, that the republic that you and your compatriots formed during your time, the republic has become more and more democratic as the centuries have passed. Do you, knowing what you know about my time, do you think that's true?
Yes, and I think in your time you like to say, well, we live in a democracy, but that's not quite so. It's not quite so. You have a Congress, and even if that Congress responds to what it takes to be the will of the people, and of course the idea that the people would have one will in a nation of 330 million individuals is probably ludicrous. But let's say that there was some moment where the people were nearly unanimously committed to a certain course of action. That has to pass two houses of Congress. There has to be a conference committee that adjusts any minor or major differences in the legislation of the House of Representatives and that of the Senate. Then the president has to sign it into law. He can veto it if he thinks that it's not in the best interests of the United States. Then the courts can get involved in this under your system, which I didn't like, by the way. The Supreme Court can strike down an act of Congress if it feels that it's in violation of some central tenet of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And so you have what John Adams called a system of checks and balances. The House of Representatives, that which is closest to the people, might flare up in a moment of international crisis. But then the Senate slows it down because they are only elected every sixth year. There are fewer of them. You know, George Washington said they're like a dish of tea. They're designed to cool off the passions of the House of Representatives. And then the president, who is the only national officer elected by all of the people, he sits in a kind of isolation, and he looks at this from a different point of view. He's not a legislator. He's an administrator, and he is the only representative of the entire nation. And he then says, well, I don't think this is the best path, so I'm going to veto this. Now, you can override my veto. That will prove that you really are serious about this, because it takes a supermajority to override the veto. Or if you think that I am at odds with the decided will of the people and am checking your democratic interests, you can impeach me. You certainly can retire me at the next quadrennial election if you don't approve of my performance as president. And so we have these restraining mechanisms, these distillations, these checks.
Back to Plato, he argues that when a democracy is as fully ripened as, say, ours is, this is the time when they fail, when they implode, when tyrants step in and seize power.
I always said that the answer to failed democracy or failed Republican government is not to despair of the capacity of the people, but to train them and to give them more responsibility, because they will become wiser, more mature, more adept at this business by practice. And so the antidote is not to throw up your hands and say the people are not capable of self-government. The answer is to entrust them with more responsibility and to train them to be a good republic.
And we all hope that that happens, Mr. President.
I feel certain that it does, but it cannot happen with extremely active public education grounded in civics training. If you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect something that never has been and never can be in a state of civilization. I've said that many times, and I mean it. You must have a well-educated citizenry if you expect them to be equal to the challenge of governing themselves.
And that, sir, I believe is the great wisdom of our conversation today. I thank you.
I hope that this has done two things, that it has clarified my understanding of what a republic is as opposed to a democracy, and that it has discouraged people from reading Plato.
Noted, sir. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be speaking with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson, and also your weekly conversation with the creator of the show, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I almost feel like I should apologize for sort of hijacking this conversation. I really wanted to talk to the president to get his take on republics and democracy and too much freedom.
Well, there are two things we've talked about, really. One is Plato and one is the nature of a republic. Let's do Plato first. I love Plato. I get why Jefferson would not like Plato, because Jefferson is essentially a Democrat, and Plato believes that the people are never up to it. That it's insane to think that the people are capable of governing themselves, and that democracy is mobocracy, and the people will just vote themselves largesse from the public till and will take no significant responsibility for their lives, and so on and so forth. So Plato's going to rub Jefferson the wrong way for two reasons. One is his politics, which Jefferson found appalling, and secondly, Plato's theory of forms, which I find intriguing. I'm just surprised that we can all see a chihuahua that really is no different from a rat and realize that it's a dog. I mean, think of the number of things that are
Wait
dogs.
a minute.
No, I mean, I've you see a Chihuahua and then you see a Mastiff or a German Shepherd, and you think, in what sense are these both dogs? I mean, most horses look like horses, but dogs take on a very wide variety of forms, and yet everyone gets it. That's a dog. Chairs. There are 50, 60, 100 different designs for chairs, but we all get that there's chairness, that there's some sort of a chair has to do certain things in order to be a chair. So Plato saw this, and he believed that the real world was an immeasurable world, and that this world was a set of imperfect approximations to that real world. And if you see, say, a beautiful woman, depending on, of course, the culture's concept of feminine beauty, she's either close to the perfect idea of a woman, or she's somewhere in that path. In other words, that there are gradations of any single object's resonance with the ideal form of beauty. So when you see a very beautiful woman or see a very handsome man, what you're responding to is their approximation to this Platonic ideal. And to the extent that we vary from that we veer away from that, according to Plato, then we say that person is not handsome, or that person is not beautiful, etc., or ugly at the other end of the spectrum. So, and I love teaching Plato. I've taught Plato's Socratic dialogues over and over, and they're great. The Apology, the Crito, the Phaedo, they're marvelous dialogues. But I also have taught the Republic, and I will say this to all of our listeners. Don't listen to Jefferson when he says the Republic is not worth it. the Republic is worth it. It's one of the world's great books.
But I confess to you that I had a great deal of difficulty with it.
When I teach the Republic, I invariably say we will not start with book one. It consists of a number of books. Really, they're long chapters. And if you start with book one of the Republic, it is very hard ever to want to finish it. But if you start with book two and read book two through the end, and then go back with that knowledge and then tackle book one, it's dramatically less frustrating as a great work of literature.
Well, I want to stay on this topic, but just as an insert here, is this a key to understanding Jefferson and his contemporaries, the writings of Plato and his reaction to it?
No, you don't need to know Plato to understand Jefferson. But when you know that Jefferson believed that the soul is corpuscular, don't you find that kind of amazing? Do you believe that the soul is corpuscular? That when you die, your soul's dead, period, gone, that's it, no more?
You know, that's a tough question, and not one you can just answer.
Hey, you brought it up.
No, you did.
You're the one who got us onto Plato.
You know, is there something there? Absolutely.
What? But does it die when you die?
Well, you would have to really, and I don't mean to be dodging this, but you would have to be able to absolutely define death to answer that question. I can't do that.
Well, most people, as you know, even now, in our time of profound technology, most people believe that there is a soul, and when you die, the soul goes to heaven or wanders about.
I think
or
most people
to
want
exist.
to believe that we have meaning.
Yes.
More than they want to believe we have a soul. They want to believe that we have meaning.
I don't know the answer to this. All I know is that Jefferson is really hard-headed about this, about his notion that there's no metaphysics. There's only physics, that metaphysics, that's what beyond measurable, beyond that which is physical. Jefferson believed no such thing exists. We live in a world where most people believe that there is a metaphysics, that there are things that are not measurable.
Okay, you're a Jefferson scholar.
Yes.
Don't you think you could make a strong argument against what you just said?
Against what?
That what Jefferson believed, that you're saying he had no belief in anything beyond?
He's not consistent, because once in a while he'll say to, like John Adams after Abigail died, he wrote this lovely letter of condolence and says something like, "It won't be long before we're reunited with our
there
wives."
You go. Yeah.
Jefferson is inconsistent, and so when I talk about this, the evangelicals always kind of go nuts over this, because they say, "See, you're distorting him because he did believe in heaven." But here's what's really true, I think, is that Jefferson was a materialist. He was anti-metaphysical. He was anti-Platonic. I don't think he believed in heaven and hell. But I think that he understood two things. First of all, the momentum of tradition carried him along at times into saying things that, strictly speaking, weren't true, especially, say, in a letter of condolence. And he wasn't 100% certain all of the time about his rational principles, but he tried to be that rational being. He's the man who said that within 50 years he thought every young American would be a Unitarian.
Right.
He wasn't making that up. He really thought that was true. But there's kind of it's just like his Bible. Jefferson was essentially an atheist. He didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ. He believed that Jesus was a man, and
not believing in Jesus doesn't make him an atheist.
No, but Jefferson is a deist. Jefferson believes in most moods that there is a God, and that God has created the solar system and so on, but that God is not someone we can communicate with by way of prayer. But there are even moments of prayer in Jefferson. My point is that for all of his boldness and free thinking, there's also kind of a second Jefferson who's much more of a traditional person of his world, and that he's sort of lagging behind the Jefferson of the Enlightenment, and they have to negotiate with each other, and they don't always negotiate in a way that's perfectly clear to us. And I think that's the source of all this confusion, because if you run into a serious evangelical American of the Bartons, Barton Jefferson's, the guy who writes that Jefferson was a traditional Christian, they look for anything in Jefferson's writings that appear to be traditionally Christian. And then they say, "See, that's who he really was. When I look at this, I say, see, that's the lingering part of Jefferson that wasn't entirely resolved. You can't rule it out, but you wouldn't want to get stuck there because the overwhelming majority of his writings are anti-Trinitarian, anti-clerical, Unitarian. His writings are almost emphatically of the belief that Jesus could not suspend the laws of Newtonian mechanics. His writings almost always say that Jesus was almost certainly a great man, but not the Son of God, etc. And so the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence is that Jefferson was a deist bordering on an atheist and that he was a believer that Jesus was merely a man. But you can never say that categorically because there are just enough of these lingering fossil traditions in Jefferson, or times when he postures, when he says in the Declaration of Independence, nature and nature's God, he's probably saying that for rhetorical effect in large part, but the evangelicals like David Barton seize on that and say, that's it. And then if you say, well, that's really probably just an echo of a more traditional Jefferson, then they say, no, now you're a liberal distorting the evidence. So you can't win. But as a historian, you have to argue for what you think the actual truth is. And I would say that the truth is that Jefferson was leaning into a secular atheist world, but not quite willing to step off that precipice.
And the thing I'm left thinking about as well is that I can't imagine when Jefferson said these things or wrote these things that he had that he was motivated by the judgment of others. Do you know what I mean?
I don't think he was, but remember, for example, his Bible, he wouldn't share with anybody. And he was incredibly secretive about it because he didn't, first of all, he didn't believe it was his right to intrude in other people's questions of faith.
Notes on the state of Virginia, he didn't
want that published either.
Right. So, I'm sure you could just go through a list of things that
he was very private.
Burned his letters.
You see, the thing is, and I felt this in my extremely lower level life. If you tell the truth about how you actually see the world, you will be punished severely. If you tell the truth that, for example...
Boy, that's grim.
No, it's true, though. If you tell the truth...
I try to.
about what corporate capitalism is willing to do to maintain its control of the world. Karen Silkwood, running people off of roads, trumping up charges of child pornography or whatever. We know that so much is at stake in the energy industry, for example. Nuclear, coal, even solar, hydrogen. So much is at stake in the auto industry. So much is at stake in banking that there are entities that will pay essentially any price. Now, they would rather work within the law. They'd rather lobby and deregulate. But they are willing to do what it takes to maintain their trillions of dollars of cash flow and their billions of dollars of profit. And they will do what it takes, including hurt people, destroy people. We see this all the time. And if you say this, they go nuts. But it's true. The truth, people don't want to hear the truth because they want to believe they live in a fairy tale and that they live in a world where civics still exist. They don't want to believe that there's a shadow government that really runs the world. They don't want to believe that our nation assassinates foreign leaders.
They want to believe our lives have meaning.
They want to believe that we have meaning, and they're willing to listen to a series of fictions.
We all do.
Because they want the world to work. But the fact is, when you see the truth, that the world is willing to destroy, that extremely powerful entities, individuals and corporations, and other institutions, churches, are willing to destroy that which gets in their way, it's very damaging. And people are so eager to live in a meaningful world that in some sense they would rather subscribe to a fiction they've kind of seen through than to be courageous enough to face the world as it actually is. And if you do face the world as it actually is, there are people who will try to destroy you. And I can tell you as an iron fact in my little world that this has been true. And it must be infinitely more true in the world at higher levels of access and power.
Goodness, you came You came home from Rome a bit dark, sir.
No, it's David, it's I don't mean to be dark, but when you see what happens, that watchdogs are really damaged by the power structure, and courageous newspaper men and women who break stories about institutional sexual abuse or corruption, or
some of them have movies made about them and win Academy Awards.
And some of them are very deeply damaged and destroyed in the process, because what we know is that these giant institutions are essentially amoral if it really has to happen. In other words, if let's just say Monsanto Corporation, I'm just making it up, if Monsanto Corporation knew that you could bring them down by exposing X and Y and Z, they would do what it takes in litigation, intimidation. They would do what it takes to try to shut you up. I'm not saying they would do something that was...
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here, because I live with somebody who does work like that.
No, I believe that these entities rule the world, and they then allow us to believe that our president or our Congress or our city council or whatever actually have the authority to make important decisions about life. And we all want to believe that because we all want to live in the world of the civics textbook that we read in 8th grade, but it isn't so. And just take one example. When the Sandy Hook shootings occurred and so on, public opinion was like 70% to do something.
I think it was higher than that.
And what happened?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Why? Because a tiny minority of, let's say, 15 million Americans, with an incredibly sophisticated lobbying effort, were able to intimidate our leaders, our representatives, into denying what was by then the decided will of the American people.
Which really brings this full circle back to this article that it sort of inspired me to talk to Jefferson about Plato. It was written by Andrew Sullivan. Democracies end when they are too democratic. And really, I didn't get into the article at all because it's mostly, it's really an anti-Trump article talking about how when we reach this point of democracy, tyrants can take over, and that's the gist of his article. There are some points in it that are good, and as you're talking these dark points here,
how dark is it?
I'm nodding.
How dark is it? I watched the film Concussion with Will Smith on the way back from Europe, and it's based on the truth, and it's about how an African doctor, a pathologist who was dissecting a former NFL football player, doing an autopsy, discovered that that his concussions had caused severe brain damage. The NFL did everything in its power to destroy this man. They intimidated him. They got him fired. They got his bosses fired. They lied. They bribed. They denied. And guess what? He was right. He was right about concussions. It's now a quasi-orthodoxy.
The point I wanted to make is that I think we see this in our society today by what's going on politically, not just on the right but on the left. The people are aroused.
The people are aroused, and so you have Bernie Sanders on the left and a Donald Trump on the right saying, we're going to take back this country. One is doing it from a very high-minded way. One is doing it in the gutter. They're both saying we're going to take back this country. And my view is don't touch those energies unless you really mean to do it. But if you stir that latent remaining idealism in the American character and then you betray it in some way, you have done a profoundly cynical thing to a people who are deeply and earnestly frustrated about public life in this country. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this special rebroadcast of the Thomas Jefferson Hour from 2016, titled Too Much Freedom.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.